Hello everybody. Though I've always been a big fan of doing things a little bit differently, and in my career I've often focused on brands like Lotus and Aston Martin, if you are on the hunt for a sports car for less than £30,000, you would be somewhat foolish to ignore the potential of a Porsche, because for that money you could get your hands on any number of brilliant Boxsters, Caymans or 911s, cars that are often regarded as the segment leader for a very good reason. However, at that price point, there is a good chance the cars you're going to be looking at are ones that are affected by some rather famous issues. Ones that, in the worst case scenario, can require your engine to be rebuilt, a process which might cost more than the value of the car. Something that, of course, nobody wants to have to deal with. But in that worst case scenario, there is one company here in the UK that have developed a reputation as the go-to people to fix your poorly Porsche. That's Hartech. And when I got an email from them a couple of months ago saying if I'd like to come and visit their Bolton-based workshop and see exactly how they fix these cars, what they do, and to drive a few, I had to say yes. So that's where we are today. I'm here. We're going to get out of this somewhat noisy exterior, head inside, show you a little bit of what goes on behind the scenes, talk you through the things you need to know, might not need to worry about, and at the end, I'll also drive a few cars. Enjoy. So here we are in what they call the showroom, but actually is more of a waiting room where just some of the 250 plus cars a year that Hartech deal with are sat ready for their new beating hearts. Not every single engine is sent here in a car. For some customers, they prefer to have the engine removed, sent over, the work done, and then returned. For international customers, Hartech also have agents in a number of different countries, and that means wherever you are in the world, if you do need a fix for your poorly Porsche, you should be able to find it here in the back end of Bolton. But what exactly is it that actually goes wrong with these cars anyway, and which ones fail? Well, I'll answer that second question first. The cars affected are all of those fitted with an M96 or M97 engine. The ones that sound like that. Quite good, got a real snarl at low RPM. And that is almost all of the 996 generation and 997.1, that's the pre-facelift generation of the 911. The exceptions being the Turbo and GT models, which have at their core an evolution of the old air-cooled Metzger engine. The other cars affected are all of the 986 generation Boxsters and all of the 987.1 Boxster and Caymans. Now, I don't know about you, but I absolutely love coming to a proper old school engineering workshops where you get to see stuff like this. Engine blocks freshly and correctly machined. Beautiful, fresh, custom-made pistons. This is really, really cool stuff, and I find it very exciting. But I wager for many people watching, this is also the stuff of nightmares, because to get this sort of stuff means you've likely had an engine failure and you've had to spend a lot of money to fix what might well be your pride and joy. So then, what exactly is it that happens that means this might one day occur? Well, if you've done any kind of reading at all over the last 20 years on this generation of Porsche, there'll be three issues you'll almost certainly have already heard of. That is IMS, RMS, and bore scoring. But what are they? What causes them? And do you really need to be that worried? Well, to explain that, I'm going to hand you over to somebody far more knowledgeable than I.
Hello, I'm Julian Thompson. I'm the Technical Engineering Director. I've been at Hartech for just over 3 years. Prior to that, I've always worked in the automotive industry for Jaguar Land Rover as a development engineer on exhaust systems. So I've got a wide range of manufacturing knowledge in engines, combustion systems, those kind of things. Bore score is where, because these engines have a very silicon-rich bore, this is done in the casting process, and it's made as a very fine controlled matrix that has high silicon content that's then cast when the block's cast. The problem with this is the particles of silicon are very large, and what happens is, as the early engines had an iron-coated piston, the iron-coated piston was able to resist these fragments when they come out. of the engine and flush them through into the engine. But later, we think due to health and safety issues or cost implications, the iron coating was removed and they changed to a plastic coating. And what happens with the plastic coating is it deteriorates over time due to heat and the environment the engine's in. And then basically you've got a bare aluminium, because the actual coating comes away, you've got bare aluminium. When a particle of silicon comes out, it can actually move between the piston and the liner. It drags these large particles up and down, and it's a bit like a hole in a road where you've got gravel and it just gets bigger and bigger. And effectively what the end result is this, and you'll have a similar kind of pattern in your bore. And this is what's known as bore score. This is an engine removed from a customer's Cayman S. It's come in with bore score. So what we do is we'll strip the engine and evaluate all the components. On this engine, one of the things that's worth pointing out is the IMS shaft sits in the bottom of the engine, runs from the front to the rear. The rear is supported by a bearing, which I'll show you in a moment, and the back end is supported because it powers the oil pump through the actual oil pump gallery. The purpose of the IMS shaft is because, in a quest to save money, Porsche commonised the casting, making the two cylinder heads, and then the machines did differently. The problem is the cam chain drive is on one end of the engine, so when you've got an actual casting that you've got to rotate to fit the other side, it means you've got to have a cam chain drive at either end of the engine. The only way to do this is to actually use an IMS shaft, which runs both banks at the same time. And here I've actually got, so this is actually the IMS shaft. This is the problematic component, and the component that usually goes wrong with these, it's not a major, huge problem, as some people say, is the bearing that is in the end of the actual drive that goes from the crank to the actual IMS shaft. So this is the problematic area. So as you can see on this is the drive that comes from the crankshaft, and these are the two drive chain sprockets that feed both the heads on each bank. So this actually sits across in the bottom of the engine. You can actually see the spider on the end in this location. The other problematic area that has been reported is the rear main seal, and the rear main seal sits on the end of the crankshaft right at the very bottom, and the seal actually sits between the crankshaft and the housing. The reason for the problems with the seal is when the actual drive centre is actually machined for the seal's position, the internal crank carrier is offset slightly because of all the machining tolerances. You get a slight offset of up to about 6 to 8 thousandth of an inch. And the problem with that is that then your actual crankshaft isn't running concentric within the hole for your rear main seal. And the problem with that is then that you've got the risk of getting leaks because of that slight offset. Porsche did correct this by making a flexible seal that allowed for the offset, but even then they still occasionally have problems with this, just due to the nature of how it's actually built and manufactured. A lot of people actually ask, what is the difference between the different bearings in an IMS shaft? This is the first bearing that was fitted by Porsche. This is what's called a dual row IMS. So it's got two rows of balls inside. This was actually made as a purpose designed bearing for Porsche. It's not a standard off the shelf part. And due to earlier failures, because the fact you've got two rows of bearings means that you've got, as the grit with the grease builds up as the bearing wears, you've actually got two surface areas of wear, so you've got twice as much grit that you're generating. Porsche soon realised this wasn't suitable, so they then upgraded to the next bearing. This has got a deeper row bearing, so this has actually got a deeper bed where the actual bearings row inside, so it's actually got a higher load rating. So this was more durable. We at Hartech were never happy with both designs, so we fairly early on realised we could do with a bigger bearing, and Porsche did the same at the same time. So this is the later bearing. As you can see, there's a significant size difference between the two, so you've got a significant increased loading. So the actual loading of this is far superior. This is what all the later Cayman S's and the 3.8s were fitted with from about 2005 onwards. The problem with replacing these bearings is that the two earlier bearings you could replace because the aperture in the side, the actual engine is the same size as this, so you can actually remove the bearing. Obviously, the later bearings are a lot bigger in diameter, so to replace that you've got to split the cases to get the bearing out to actually replace it. When the IMS bearing fails, the problem is then you've lost the actual control position of the IMS shaft. So because the bearings failed, you actually get the actual shaft drifts, and it can cause cam timing issues, which then means you're getting piston to valve contact, which obviously is not very good at all. The earlier IMS shafts had a sprocket on the end that was the actual drive from the crank to the IMS shaft that was the same as this, so it was a chain, so they're called a duplex chain drive. And in an improvement, they changed this into a high-ver drive, so it's a lot more durable, stronger chain, because they were getting wear, early rapid wear. so they actually changed to this design. So, but one of the things we can do is on the earlier engines that have got a sprocket on this end, we can actually fit a larger bearing. We've designed our own IMS end that we replace on these parts to actually enable us to fit the bigger bearings. So the early engine, when we rebuild it, is as strong as the later engines that we rebuild as well. One of the key problems as well that was identified early on with bearings in these engines was that the grease that encapsulates the actual bearing balls actually creates a grinding paste, because as the bearing wears, the actual particles of wear actually get into the grease and turn to a grinding paste, which actually rapidly accelerates the actual degradation of the bearing. So one of the things that is better for a bearing is actually the fact it's in an oil bath, because it's in the sump of the engine, so you've got a constant feed of oil as what they call splash lubrication, which actually is a better lubrication property for the actual bearing that makes it last longer. One of the things we do on later engines is we fit these without a seal, so that the actual bearing is already in the nice oil mist atmosphere of the engine, so it's getting better lubrication right from the start. Right, this is the actual IMS spider, so the actual shaft runs through the centre of here, and it actually, this is what supports the rear end of the bearing on the back of the engine, as you can see on this engine. This is one of our designs where we've actually improved the actual design of this. So we've actually designed this to, as you can see on the front surface, the original bearing has got no, it's just a tapered surface. We've actually improved this by the fact we've created this scallop in the actual bearing, so it actually feeds oil and actually is positioned in a certain way. So as the chain drives, it's throwing oil into this encapsulation area, so it's actually feeding a better, more controlled oil feed into the actual bearing. One of the things that it does do as well is it ensures when you turn the engine off, as the oil is dropping back into the sump, it actually pulls and makes sure you've got oil in the bottom of your bearing ready to actually for the next startup, so you've got instant lubrication.
So, bore scoring and IMS bearing issues are both very well known causes of engine failure. However, as these cars are getting older and mileage is increasing across the board, another serious issue has presented itself: main bearing wear. These are the bearings that support the crank itself, not to be confused with the rod bearings that are very close to them. Anybody with an E92 BMW M3 will have heard of rod bearings before, but unfortunately, unlike those, to replace the main bearings, the engine requires a full rebuild. For anybody that does need one though, Hartech have got a few more tricks up their sleeve to ensure that their engines will perform far longer than the factory built ones.
We can have either a complete car or an engine on a pallet or even a set of blocks, and we will strip the engine out of the car. We'll assess the vehicle as a whole, because we also do recommend at the same time other repairs if necessary on the vehicle. We then strip the engine into its bare components. We will actually measure all the individual components inside the engine, so we create a complete detailed report of the engine findings. We'll report this back to the customer, so and then give them the options that we'd expect to do on their engine. We offer the options of either having standard size engines, so we can do a standard 3.4 to a 3.4, and we also offer oversized capacity conversions as well. Just gives the customer a bit extra torque, makes the car a bit more special, and a lot more fun to drive, because you've got a more wider torque curve. We offer 996 3.4s, we take up to 3.7. The Cayman S we take from a 3.4 to a 3.9. The 3.6 to a 3.9 or a 4.1, and the 3.8 to a 4.1. Right, basically this is a stripped down M96 block. The original liner is basically a tube that runs from the top to the bottom of a block that is only supported in the middle. One of the problems that these engines do also suffer with is what they call de-chunking. So basically, as the piston's moving up and down the block, the force has been pushed against this area, because this is obviously the combustion area. And what happens is, due to this flexure, the whole thing has been forced sideways. So eventually, due to fatigue failures, you will get a chunk actually fail and fall out of the edge of the liner. I mean, one of the things that Porsche did do is they didn't change the casting, they just made the bores bigger. The original 3.4 was a 96mm bore, as was the 3.6. The capacity increase was by stroking it, and then the 3.8s went up to a 99mm. So you're obviously making this wall of the liner thinner and thinner. And then what we do with these engines is we machine out the complete. This is actually I think it's 99mm, so we've actually left the bottom section because we don't remove all of the material for the standard capacity conversions. And we machine a periphery in the top. And then this is actually a section of one of our liners. So we've actually got, this is to increase the cooling contact surface, so we've got improved cooling. And basically this sits inside in this method, so it's supported right at the very top. in the middle, and then on a oversized engine we actually put a support ring in place at the bottom, so it's therefore supported at 3 points, so it's a lot stiffer than the original block. And the other thing we do as well is, this is an aerospace aluminium liner that is ceramic nickel coated, so basically it's the same kind of process that's used on the turbo Mesga engine GT3 engines. So this is a lot harder wearing, a lot less prone to issues than the original material. The easiest way to detect if you've got bore score is if you look at your left-hand tailpipe on the rear of your car. If you've got a sooty tailpipe, it's indicating that your right-hand bank of the engine is burning more oil, therefore creating soot, which is an indication that you're suffering with bore score. Because as the actual liner wears away, you're increasing the clearance, which means more oil can actually pass your rings, get into your combustion chamber, and then it basically presents itself on the tailpipe. And also you will, in worst cases, you will also get a tapping noise, which actually is the noise of the piston hitting the cylinder head. Because you've removed so much of the piston surface, it's actually able to rock enough that it can just lightly tap the cylinder head. Bank 2 goes first because when the actual bank 2, when the piston is rising to on the compression stroke, the top of the piston is operating inside the bore. So what that means is that is the surface when your engine's cool that is less likely to have oil in. Bank 1 will have oil in the bottom, which is the thrust face on the bottom of that bank of your engine. So it's always going to have less lubrication, so that bank will fail first. It's a good thing if you're buying a Porsche 996 or a 997 is to get your engine bore scoped. It's quite standard practice these days, just because it is such a known issue in the Porsche world. The turbos and GT3s are a completely different engine architecture. They bear more with the air-cooled engines. They have the crankcase is very similar to an air-cooled engine that is magnesium, and the actual, what was the air-cooled liner is replaced with a nickel ceramic coated liner with a water jacket, and then the actual cylinder head is similar to the air-cooled as well. So they suffer a lot less because they don't have these inherent design features. We turn around an engine in about six to 8 weeks. We turn out a complete car. Stripping to rebuilding is about 6 to 8 weeks, and your rebuild starts at roughly about £12,000 plus VAT. An upgrade is roughly a premium on top of that of about £3,000.
Wait, in the words of the Hitchhiker's Guide, don't panic. This is the point at which many people would go, right, that's it, I don't fancy that kind of bill, I'm not having one of these Porsches. But not all of them are affected by all of these issues. And so to help, Hartech have built this table showing which engine suffers which problem. The major one to be concerned about is that bore scoring. And as you can see, there are a large number of cars which are unaffected, including all of the 986 Boxsters, as well as the 2.7 and 3.2 litre versions of the 987. Only the late 3.4s are an issue. And as proof, our own 2003 2.7 litre Boxster is currently on just shy of 190,000 miles, with no evidence ever of any IMS, RMS or engine rebuild work ever having taken place. Caymans are not identical. They have the later upgraded IMS and RMS, but both the 2.7 and 3.4 litre S can suffer bore scoring. On the 911 front, it is only the earliest 996 3.4s which do not suffer from bore scoring, all of the rest having the issue, including the first generation of 997 in both 3.6 and 3.8 litre S guys. Anecdotally, I hear more stories about failures of the S than I do the 3.6, but there is no particular reason for this to be the case. And because of this, many people choose instead to spend the extra money and buy one of the second generation 987 or 997.2s, which have an all-new engine that Porsche introduced called DFI for its direct fuel injection. However, recently I have begun to hear stories that these engines are also now suffering bore scoring, so I thought it would be wise to ask Julian if that was true.
We've started to see a few engines where we have an issue with what we call cold seizure. So the problem is, as the engine warms up, on what they call a 9A1 engine, the problem is the block's very different. These have actually got their crank carry underneath, which you can see in this engine here. Whereas the DF2, the 9A1 engines have got the crank is actually built into the bottom of the block, so it's a lot stiffer at the bottom. So as the engines warm up, the top warms up first, so it expands first, and the bottom takes longer to actually warm up. And over time we found that the actual diameter of the bore can actually shrink slightly through aging of the block, as it settles down. And what happens is that in particularly cold climates, if you start your engine in the middle of winter, you can actually get what they call cold seizures, where the piston actually gets in metal-to-metal contact with the bottom of the block. And a lot of people have attributed this to being bore score, but it's not. It's actually the fact that your piston and your block are actually contacting each other in such a position that you get a cold seizure for a moment, which then means you've got material transfer, which then, because you've damaged the piston, you're dragging that damaged area up and down the block, so you're damaging the block and the piston, and so it doesn't look like bore score, but it's not bore score, it's something totally different. I think we've seen maybe 5 to 10 engines so far with this issue.
So that's all well and good, isn't it? But also very technical. And for me, the proof of the pudding, of course, has to be in the eating, or in this case, the driving. So, to put Hartech's theories to the test, I have chosen 3 cars from a selection of some 8 demonstrators that they offered me to try and see what they're like. And we have, on my far right, a 3.4 litre early 996 that they have converted to a 3.7 litre high compression variant. More on that in a moment. Here we have a 996 C4S, currently a car experiencing something of a renaissance, which has had its 3.6 litre engine taken out to 3.9, and then, as a little preview of things to come, we have here a 997.2, which they've rebuilt from a 3.8 to a 4.2 litre. And, as I hope you've already gathered, these are things you're likely to see more of, this a little bit less of, but it is possible that we may, over the next few years, see a few more failures of cars like this, and also there'll always be somebody for whom the regular is just not enough. So I figured, while I was here, you don't hear much about these, it'd be a good idea to test it. Now, Hartech have not paid me to make this video, and to prove that, I'm now going to say that I think they are stupid. And I say that because if you were to go on the Hartech website, which is in desperate need of an update, and you wanted to know some of the numbers behind all of these cars, they're not going to tell you all that much. In fact, what they will tell you is that if you go for one of their oversized conversions, you're likely going to get something like 6 to 10% more peak power and more like 15% more torque. But that is in the mid-range, which is very good. But people do like hard and fast numbers, don't they? And the reason that Hartech don't quote them is actually very logical. That is because cars are, by their very nature, variable. When they get cars in, if they're still running and in good working order, they can and will dyno them. And they have found that even factory examples will vary in the power and the torque that they make. Once you then try and take into account any number of aftermarket modifications like air intake or exhaust, which more often than not will actually harm the performance, you can see why Hartech are a little bit wary about quoting exact numbers. However, I can quote you exact numbers for this car, which, as a 3.4 litre Carrera in its standard guise, would have made just shy of 300 horsepower and just over 260 pounds-feet of torque. But now, in 3.7 litre guise, it makes 350 horsepower and around 300 pounds-feet of torque. And that is all courtesy of a new technique that Hartech have branded Eco-Power. So what actually does that mean? Well, in short, it is a brand name for an idea that Barry Hart, the man behind Hartech, has been working with for decades now. And it actually stems from his days in motorcycle racing back in the 1970s and 80s. In fact, when I walked into the Hartech showroom for the first time, the thing I was most interested in was not the number of lovely 911s they had in there, but instead the massive poster for the David Essex film Silver Dream Racer from 1980. And when I asked what that was all about, it turns out that Barry built the Silver Dream Racer, which is quite cool. And I'm going to dine out on that when I see my mum next week, because she loves David Essex. Anyway, back in the day, he realised that if you wanted to get more torque out of something like an old two-stroke, you could do that fairly easily by raising the compression ratio. This, of course, does create some issues later on, because as the revs increase, the engine begins to get under more stress and problems can happen, but he found various methods for dealing with that. The thing is, though, that what most people go after is peak power. And peak power is lovely and great and wonderful, but mostly down the pub. What is more helpful is a bit more torque, and a bit more torque low down. And this is one of the reasons that I personally am not really keen on people that get these and change the air intake and the exhaust, because what generally happens is that, yeah, maybe you'll gain a little bit more top end, But actually, half the time it's a placebo effect, because all you've really done is just robbed yourself of your mid-range. And this isn't particularly revelatory. After all, power is simply a function of torque times RPM. And as anybody that's ever driven an S2000 will know, there are some times you really would like a little bit more go a lot sooner. We all love the idea of saying, yeah, it's great, it's brilliant, get it to 7,000 and it flies. But actually in the real world, if you want to make progress, I'd rather it flies at 3,000 RPM. And that's the philosophy that Barry has followed with these. So his aim was to increase torque. He has done this by increasing the compression, and by doing all of this, he's also increased the power. In fact, so effective was this raising the compression that to this 3.7 now makes similar numbers to this, the 3.9. In fact, the torque curve here is a little bit flatter, and because this is an earlier car, it's already a little bit lighter, so performance difference between the two is marginal. What he didn't expect, though, was the fact that when he started doing these high compression conversions, his customers started reporting an increase in fuel economy. Which he then did his calculations and realised, actually, well, yeah, that was always going to happen. The thing's more efficient, you don't have to drive it quite as hard, you can be in a higher gear if you want to, etc., etc., etc. He didn't set out to build an economical car. And when he first said we're doing a new series of eco-power engines, my first thought was, I have no interest in those whatsoever, Barry, and I'm not really sure any of your customers do either. But it turns out that the power is what they went for, the eco's what they found, which is nice. So as soon as they'd explained all of this to me, I said, okay, all right, fine, great, wonderful, high compression engine. How high compression exactly is this? And they told me, this one is now running a compression ratio of 14:1. And I wager half of you watching are sat there going, is that good? I don't know. And the other half have just fallen off your chairs. And the reason for that is because by default, this car would have run a compression ratio of around 11.3:1. That's the same as, say, an Aston Martin V8 Vantage, the V8 era, the 4.3s. This is the same as a Ferrari 458 Speciale. It's a huge difference. And to control this and to stop the engine from falling to pieces, they've employed some very clever, but actually also devilishly simple tech that stops it from falling apart at high RPM, but still giving you all of the gains you want from the low and the mid-range. It's quite cool. Right, enough jibber jabber. Let me get out in these, then I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about how they feel. Now, here's the thing. I get to drive stuff like this all of the time. And in the interest of being fair and balanced, if you don't like Porsches, one of these is not going to change your opinion. Because what they are is effectively the car that you know and love, if you do love it, but more. So I've driven both the 3.4 and the 3.6 quite a bit. In fact, I used to own a 3.6 Carrera 4S. For those that do know these cars, you will notice a difference. This one in particular, this is incredible because the regular 3.4, it's decent, it's good, but it's beginning to feel its age a little bit. You put your foot down, it doesn't go as well as you would like. This thing though, 3,000 RPM, it's gone, it's off. It's fantastic. Now, both of these cars are very, very well used. This one is currently sat on just shy of 195,000 miles. And that is why I'm not doing full reviews of these cars, partly because most of it I've already talked about and also because the other components are not what I'm here to talk about. But the engine is magnificent. This one also is very impressive. Now, makes very, very similar numbers to this. But what I really, really appreciate is that from the factory, both of these cars, they've got a slightly different character. This one is a little more top-endy, this one a little bit more mid-rangey. In fact, one of the things that I really love about the M96 engine is just how much punch it's got in the middle of that curve. But as you begin to get to the top end of the rev range, they can lose a little bit of interest. Not this one. This one is also quite a bit more linear than this. Here you really do feel a step change at about 3,000 RPM. Here it comes in close to sort of 4, but it's also a far smoother transition. You feel it a little less. And I would say this is perhaps the slightly more tractable, easier car to drive. It feels a little less spicy. Not that this is bad in any way, shape or form, or undrivable, far from it. But this one just feels a little closer to OEM. Again, it just has a little bit more. But most impressively, it now revs hard all the way to that 7,000 RPM red line. I'll be overlaying some dyno graphs and things like that to show you the numbers and tests that they've done, but you can see that they make nice, flat, decent torque, and the power curve, again, up to about 6,000 RPM is pretty nice and linear. Then it just tails off ever so slightly, as you would expect it to be. They're not GT3s all of a sudden. They never were going to be. They weren't meant to be. If you want a GT3, I'm sure if you asked Hartech, they'd tell you the easiest and cheapest way to get it is to buy a GT3. Different engine architecture, different flavour. But as road-going cars, they're fantastic. Now, the one I haven't got here today is what they actually say is one of their most popular conversions. That is the 4.1 litre for the 3.6 litre cars. And the reason I'm not driving it today is because I think if I'm going to drive that, I should spend a fair bit of time with it and evaluate it over a longer period on more familiar roads. And if you want to see that, please leave a comment in the description down below. Go on Hartech socials, tell them you saw this video and you enjoyed it and that they should give me one of their cars to borrow for a while. And if you think I should buy myself another Porsche and do a Hartech swap with it, tell me that as well. In fact, email them and tell them that they should sort me out with something, because kind of tempted, I have to say. But these are the cars you probably know about. What about that one? So we've now skipped a generation, straight past the 997.1, which incidentally has the 3.8 litre Carrera S, and that is the engine where I tend to hear the most horror stories. This, though, the 997.2, has the all-new DFI engine, and they have proven to be considerably more durable. But, as I've now found out, failures are not unheard of, and so Hartech have begun developing solutions for customers unlucky enough to have decided to skip the problems of the earlier car and find themselves with the problems of the later car. But good news, everyone, because it turns out that for this car, they have actually found maybe the most impressive gains of all. Out of the factory gates, this would have made 380 horsepower from its 3.8 litre flat 6 and around 315 pounds-feet of torque. It now makes from its 4.2 litres just over 420 horsepower and, more incredibly, 375 pounds-feet of torque. Now, despite the fact it has the same EcoPower badging as the 3.7 over there, it is not running the same high compression engine setup. But that's because it doesn't need to. It's already making more than impressive enough numbers. And now you have here a car that is almost impossible to catch out. Whatever gear, whatever RPM you're at, it has something. And if you're in the right gear and the right RPM, it's got quite something. This is a fantastic car, and I think actually would really appeal to the sort of person that wants closer to sort of GT performance, but not necessarily turbo. It's not that quick, but they want something understated, something a little bit subtle. I like it a lot. So there we have it. If you've clicked on this video, I'm sure you already know plenty about Porsches, and you've probably heard about RMS, IMS and bore scoring. You may even have heard about Hartech before, but if I've done my job correctly, now maybe you know just a tiny bit more, because I feel like I do. So if you have enjoyed today's video, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, comment if you haven't already, go and follow Hartech on all of their socials, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.